that, how about the one that is responsible for most of the suicide bombings?
Oh, that is so Islamophobic.
I am Islamophobic.
Yeah. So this idea of, suicide bombings and suicide killings and all that, it's important, again, to understand this in context and understand, where did this start? What is the history behind it? And why do people do it? And where's the connection between Islam? There's always somehow this connection between Islam and suicide bombing. That's what's in the minds of many people because that's what they consume in mainstream media, unfortunately. Let's take a look at some facts, okay? The first recorded suicide attack that we know of as human beings, as researchers, was actually done by Christian crusaders against Muslims. So there was a group of crusaders who actually sunk their own ship so that they could actually result in 10 times the deaths of Muslims on that on the expedition, right? So this is the first incident, right? This is classical. Then you fast forward to like the modern era. You find the first modern suicide bombing that's taking place in St. Petersburg, right? In let's see, what's the year I got? 1881, where they killed the Tsar, basically. The guy was not a Muslim. This was not a Muslim suicide bombing, and suicide bombings continued. It continues and it continues with kamikazes. So in war, you got the Japanese, and what they're doing is many Japanese are volunteering themselves to get in airplanes, and they go and they crash, bombs into certain, ships and to sink those ships. The Germans are practicing the same type of suicide bombing techniques during the battle for Berlin against the Russians. So they're going and they're trying to destroy the bridges that are coming. They're sacrificing their own lives for a military purpose. And then what really happened is there really wasn't much suicide bombing during the Cold War period. That's really interesting. The reason why and this is important for everyone to understand, specifically Joe, is that the reason why there wasn't suicide bombing during the Cold War period is because the superpowers of the US and Russia, Soviet Union, they're equipping these little countries that are fighting with each other, right? They're equipping them with a lot of weapons. When you have a lot of weapons to fight other people back with, you don't need suicide bombing. So then what happened is that we don't see much during the Cold War. The next instance of suicide bombing that we start seeing is in Lebanon. So in Lebanon, when Israel goes and occupies Lebanon in the early 80s, you get a movement of people who cannot fight back against superior military technology that Israel has. So they start getting this idea of, let's go start doing the suicide bombings. What's really interesting, and this is how suicide bombing became prevalent in modern society today. It started in Lebanon particularly, and what's really interesting is 77% of the people who were engaging in suicide bombings in Lebanon, they were communists or socialists. They were not doing it for Islamic reasons. They were not doing it because, they're inspired to do for some Muslim cause or something like that. And what's more interesting is 8% of them were Christian as well, right? So this is not a religious thing. This is a secular thing, meaning in the sense that it's something that people are doing because they have no other military option to carry out anything. And then when people saw that Israel actually backed out of Lebanon, they say, oh, well, it looks like suicide bombing's potentially working, and we don't have any resources to fight back, we should do something along these lines, right? So now somehow, what's going on in the world today is whenever you find a group of people, it doesn't matter if it's the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka who are not religious, this is not a Muslim group, they have nothing to do with Islam at all, they were conducting suicide bombings against the government so that they could get their own Tamil region, right? Why are they doing this? This is a way for people who don't have many resources to fight back for whatever cause they're fighting for. So when you're deciding who's a terrorist and what's a terrorist and who's fighting and who's suicide bombing, the first thing you got to ask yourself is this cause justified, what they're fighting for? Are they freedom fighters or are they terrorists? The second thing is, do they have the ability to fight or they don't have the ability to fight back? If they don't have any weapons and they're being oppressed or they have no resources whatsoever, then yeah, they might be willing to utilize their bodies. What does all of this have to do with Islam? Absolutely nothing. There is absolutely nothing connected with the religion of Islam that's saying you should go and use yourself as use your body as a way of going and, targeting a specific bomb at an individual or going and, killing innocent civilians or all the other things that are somehow connected or tied to suicide bombing. So this idea of, Islam is responsible for suicide bombing is just another one of those, just fake misleading propaganda statements that just keeps being thrown out there, and it kind of takes away the context of what is the political circumstance going on in that specific area, in that country, where we need to analyze, is this struggle just or unjust? Killing of innocent civilians is never just. It's never allowed in Islam. But that's not even, when people say suicide bomb, they're not even talking about that. They have a problem with this idea of suicide and bombing and killing or whatever it is. This is a military thing. It's a political thing. In order for this to take place, there needs to be a political context. That's what needs to be kept in mind.
And who I see who substantiate academics, they don't bring them on mainstream media because it doesn't support the narrative.
No.
And it would educate the public to the awareness of really what's going on in these areas of the world. That Robert Pape, the terrorist expert, he analyzed over 1,000 different terrorist attacks to date, and he talks about, this has little to nothing to do with Islam or religion. A lot of times he said that many of these are secularists, he says, and people are about to do a suicide attack, and now they're going to face death, and all of a sudden they become religious. Right? Because that's it. Now people find God at the end. And now they cling on to it. But in reality, it's because they want the occupying force out of there, and like you're saying, they have no other means. And again, anything to do with Islam now?
Yeah, no, it's all political.
It's political.
It's political.
That's exactly what the terrorist expert, Dr. Robert Pape, an
that's
academic from the University of Chicago,
says. That's what every terrorist expert says, that, there's a political, objective that's there. You need to justify that objective. You're gonna justify it either with nationalism, Nazi party, neo-Nazi, whatever it is. You're gonna justify it with some religion that you practice. You're gonna justify it with your superiority of your race. You need to justify the political objective. Some people will use religion to justify it. Some people will use nationalism. Some people will use race. They'll use other factors. If there's no political objective, then there's not going to be any terrorism.
In my opinion, it's injustice, humiliation, oppression that are the most common causes of terrorism.
Some people claim that religion motivates terrorists. However, the academic research of Dr. Robert Pape has proved the claim to be false.
What I did is I collected the first complete database of every suicide terrorist attack around the world since 1980. The first version of this database was published a few years ago, and it went from 1980 to 2003. Think of that as like the pre-Iraq database. And then the second version from 2004 on, think of that as the data that's happened since Iraq. And what the data shows quite clearly is that the principal cause of suicide terrorism is foreign occupation. In that period from 1980 to 2003, there were 315 completed suicide terrorist attacks by 462 suicide terrorists who actually killed themselves. I don't mean attempts. These are people who actually killed themselves. The world leader during that 24-year period was not an Islamic group at all. They're the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. The Tamil Tigers are a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. In fact, over half of those 462 suicide attackers were purely secular. Because you see, many Muslim suicide terrorist groups are also purely secular, such as the PKK in Turkey. The PKK in Turkey, which did numerous suicide attacks in the 1990s, is again a Marxist, read anti-religious suicide terrorist group. Because you see, if Islam as sort of a radical religion, or if it were just radical Muslims doing this, then what you would expect is sort of this thin veneer of suicide attack kind of scattered all around the world. You would expect that, there's 1.4 billion Muslims, there's this teeny tiny fringe of Muslims kind of everywhere who'd be willing to do suicide attack, but that's not the way the data looks. It's really concentrated, and it's really concentrated in occupations.